Hey everyone, I'm Kate, editor-in-chief of Vidoe, and the film head over there too. And I also do TV. And we're back with the reviews for Amazon Prime Video's Good Rivals. And I'm here with Aaron.
Hello.
And we're both sporting our World Cup teams. Obviously, Mexico and Mr. Three Lions over there. For England, Aaron, really excited to get to talk with you about this because I've kind of been on an athletics like soccer slash or football to make my people happy. Like documentary kick because it's
Yeah.
World Cup, and I'm probably more invested and more involved in World Cup than like I've been in previous years. So I'm yeah, for those of you who don't know, Good Rivals is a three-part docu-series about one of the most unique and intense competitions in international sports, the rivalry between the Mexican and American national men's soccer teams. Good Rivals will peel back the political, social, and sporting layers of a rivalry that has become must-see TV for the past 30 years. Far more than just a sports documentary, Good Rivals spotlights the personal and professional arcs of stars from each nation, like Landon Donovan and Rafa Marquez, who became symbols of their country's cultures during their respective careers in the early and mid 2000s. Good Rivals will also examine the passionate international battle for on-field talent and fan support that has made the US-Mexico border one of the most fascinating soccer frontiers in the world, with players and families from both countries becoming the focus of recruiting battles between these two deeply interconnected nations. So Aaron, when you came into this, what were your expectations?
Um, it's something that I was surprised about once it kind of hit my inbox. I had no idea this was coming to the forefront, but I figured it was kind of like an interesting premise to dive deeper into because it's not something I was deeply aware of until I really moved to the country. And even then, once, after I'd moved to the US, it took me a number of years of talking to people, kind of learning about it and seeing it on TV to realize how big of a rivalry this had been. And it's something like, coming from, from England, from Europe, I didn't even realize with the Gold Cup and,
Yeah.
elements of that there was so much weight behind it. I'd never really paid much attention to it, to be honest. But in living here and kind of seeing it, I was just like, oh, this would be interesting. I'm sure there's some detail, there's some history there to kind of to really dive into to see what really prompted this like heated rivalry. Like, and it's some of the games can get so physical as well. So it really piqued my interest. I thought it would be fascinating to dive into. So yeah, I was surprised by it, but yeah, I don't know what you thought heading into it.
Yeah, for me, it was really interesting because like I've known that it was a rivalry, but like I am in central South Texas. Like I grew up in San Antonio, which is a 70% Latino population. 90% of the 70% is Mexican American. So like I've just been surrounded by support for Mexico my entire life. I really never saw anybody root for the US until
Yeah.
coming to Austin. And that was like interesting because obviously the US didn't play in the 2018 World Cup. So I didn't see anybody like when the World Cup was happening then. And so like going in, like I was really curious as to what the extent the rivalry was. Cause like I said, like I was pretty isolated from it. Like everybody just rooted for Mexico. There really wasn't any question about it at all. It was just what we did. Found out why in this documentary, thankfully, which we'll get into. But yeah, I would say I was really surprised. I think that if you're watching World Cup now, it's just really fun to like
Yeah.
learn more about the team's histories, and then knowing that like Mexico and the US, while they don't play a lot outside of like CONCACAF or like qualifiers, like they do friendlies
Yeah.
around because they make a lot of money on them. So like if you're bitten by that World Cup bug, like why not learn about a rivalry you can go watch? So
Absolutely.
um but yeah, I think kind of going off of that, like the first thing I want to like really touch on is really some of the things that we've learned from this documentary. Because I think a good documentary doesn't just entertain, but it lets you walk away with something new. I think for me,
It's like an educational, like
exactly. You
it's
walk out of it
balanced.
with something more than
Yeah,
what you walked into it with.
absolutely.
Um, and I think for me, I'm gonna be honest, I expected the series because I didn't know how much racism was involved in the rivalry. And I expected like an American produced series to gloss over it. Like I thought that it would be
To
like,
kind of
okay, yeah,
primarily focus on the sporting element.
exactly. And what I found was really what I had been hearing a lot leading up to this World Cup, that football is a nexus of cultural, social, political tensions between countries. It represents so much more than just kicking around a ball on a field. And given US Mexico relations, particularly from the signing of NAFTA in the 90s through today, like that is a tension, and the tension between countries is felt. And I think one thing
Yeah,
that the series does really well is it quantifies that in what it looks like from the player's standpoint. Like they interject packages of Congress people, not just Republicans. Miss Dianne Feinstein's on there too, because she also didn't like us, talking about quote unquote illegals and like all of
yeah.
this. And it culminates to what I learned from it, which is I didn't learn that Mexico fans show up to US Mexico games, and like because the Southwest was Mexico and it has a high Mexican American population, we show up and we overpower US supporters. I I knew vaguely because my husband had told me that they had moved the games to Columbus, Ohio in an attempt to get more US involvement. In the documentary, the words that they used, all American stadium, like
Doesn't sit well, does
it
it?
hurts because
Ah,
Mexican Americans are American. Like I have literally, like my family, I can trace back to the founding of Texas. Like I am native and I am Mexican, but like I am that in a way that is to this land and that
yeah,
is now a part of the US. So like it was kind of like, well, yeah, of course they're not showing up for you, Landon Donovan, because you are sounding like an absolute ass. But when you kind of take that out, it's like, okay, I can at least understand from a player perspective. You're in your home, you're in your home country, you don't have the support. Okay, I get that. But I think what stung more is learning the calculated moves that the US made to ensure that they could win qualifiers by essentially moving the Mexican team into the coldest climate that they could find and ripping any sort of support. And I think one of the things that needs to be highlighted even more so is Columbus has one of the lowest populations of Latinos in the entire United States.
yep.
So you're also putting them into a hostile environment, which the documentary does a good job of showing in 20 in the 2016 game. But then you have the one little piece that kind of got a little glossed over, which was the commissioner at the time said that in order to do this, to ensure that they had their people, our people in the stands, they limited ticket sales to Mexican Americans, particularly like by pushing stuff through MLS ticket holders. And so it kind of put it all together for me that like, oh, a lot of this rivalry, like it's deeply racist. And the Mexicans that I know, the Mexican Americans that I know, we don't root for the US because we were literally iced out of it. Like there
Yeah,
was never another option because tactfully they tried to remove us as any sort of base in soccer unless we were there to give them money for friendlies to even have a chance to support the US. And I think that that was something that like it was kind of hard to hear because like growing up like Mexicans, Latinos, like they were the
yeah,
ones that were keeping soccer alive. Like we
yeah.
were the ones that were like getting made fun of for not liking football as much or not, you know what I mean? And so to know that like the team spinning up, the US team not becoming a joke, relied on suppressing us and our involvement. Like, yo, that sucks.
Well, and it's tough as well because as a parent and a coach of kids in the sports, the soccer system, it's unfortunately trickled down like a lot of soccer elements that are grassroots. Like I grew up and like soccer was, the working class sport. You
Yeah.
needed a ball and you could play like, I think you hear with this, or Rafa Marquez says like, you grab two bricks and they were the goal and you play in the street. And it's similar in England. There's places where you can walk down streets and there's spray paint of a goal on the side because
Yeah.
we lived in a concrete jungle. Like there's in some areas there's not a lot of green space you can run around in. So it was funny for me because like again knowing that it's a working class sport and people from all kinds of backgrounds were encouraged and welcomed into it, and then to see it at the US level, to see it at the MLS, like just the amount of money that you need to even get your kids to play, to go and see an MLS game is extraordinary money. And I'm just like, this is so exclusionary. And
The
it really
first
caught me off guard.
the first year that Austin FC had games, mind you, their name is the Verde, because they have leaned in hard to the Mexicanness.
Yeah.
$700 a seat.
Oh my God.
$700 a seat.
It's insane. Like, and it hurts me because like, again, the roots of the sport, like there's literally like it was played between towns in England. Like when you see like when they actually formed leagues and they had like it was, you'd have all these like working class people surrounded, they'd hold the rope like
Yeah.
to mark out the field, like and everything like that. So it's roots, the whole foundation is in working class people. So it's so hard for me to see it. And then watching this documentary, it's just so clearly highlighted that it was intended that way. It was structured that way, and it's now filtered down through the years. It's a very hard pill to swallow.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the things that and I think the documentary does a good job of kind of balancing the things that you learn too. Like Mexican fans aren't great. We all know that. They're a little
I was gonna say,
aggressive. Yeah.
Rafa Marquez in it as well, like where he says like his history with his dad and how like his grandfather kind of left them and like they'd
Yeah.
struggled and he now had to carry the weight of his family as a young man, like his
Yeah.
dad did. But then like see like he talks about it like the Mexican culture as far as like leaving for America and then it changing them and then coming back and bringing that, and it grew this distaste
Yeah.
for him internally as far as what the country stood for.
Exactly. And I think that like that's a tension that like I don't think gets explored enough. And I think like why, and I think that it's something really interesting. So we have a World Cup chat on our Discord, discord.gg/Vidoe though. And there's a lot of like Mexican Americans in it. And
Yep.
I like all of us support Mexico with the exception of one. And he had a really good reason. Like Mexican kids growing up treated him like crap because they did not see him as Mexican enough. And so it's like one of those things where it's like you come to the US, like if you come to the US, you're Americanizing yourself that way. If you're born here and your family has always been here, you're never going to fit in particularly with Mexicans from Mexico. And there's a division that we all really know. But soccer, like for whatever reason, soccer has been like the one piece that like I've been able to feel like connected with, because I don't feel connected in anything else. And I think that it's really sad when you look at the way that like the divisions get drawn, because like in a similar to the experience that person had, which is extremely valid, is like I wasn't going to root for the US anyway. Definitely not rooting US now because they don't want me. But like I have seen how racist and volatile like American fans get when Mexicans play. And like both fans like have issues. Like Mexican fans are known for being rowdy and known for being aggressive in not great ways. But like I think that there's a different dynamic when you're Mexican American and like being like, oh, that's weird, but then also being like, oh yeah, but this guy is like a moment away from calling me a slur if Chicharito scores. Like that, like there are those things, and that's what the rivalry breeds. I think one of the things that I'd like to know from like your perspective, like especially being from somebody from such a, I don't want to say powerhouse, but like from a country that is very
Established.
involved, established
Yeah.
soccer country. Like, what was, I guess, your read overall with either like the participation from US and Mexico in general, and like the rivalry itself? I know you kind of mentioned already you didn't notice it too much, but
No, and it's interesting because like again, growing up around soccer, around football, like and again being immersed in it from such a young age because when like I guess that's the strange thing coming from a country that where its dominant sport is just the one sport everything lives and breathes. Like
yeah.
you, the whole country's like motivation, it's just emotions are driven by the results of these games. Like, and it's crushing. Like the day after a World Cup loss is awful. Like you can feel the sadness in the air. Um, and it's interesting because Mexico's always been, while they haven't always been massively successful, they've always been around.
Yeah.
They've always been
We
there.
can always make it to the group of 16.
That's and Mexico always like they're known for playing passionately and they play like when they're playing well, their flair in football is fantastic. Heck, 1986, the invention of like the Mexican wave, like they're established in the world of football internationally, and everyone's always known about Mexico. The thing that's changed, obviously, in the last few decades is like kind of the emergence of the US more so, and it's been slow to take on, but I guess it didn't shock me watching this, like how much of a struggle it was, like seeing
Yeah.
fans getting involved because, like, yeah, like because you can see it in Mexico, like they're like the rest of the world, like it's a
It's
it's a
soccer.
cheap sport. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's soccer.
it's
It's
football.
a
Yeah.
cheap sport to play. You need a ball, and the rest of it you can make up along the way. There's so many games I saw people play with soccer, and that's why it's just cheap. And for a lot of countries where it's working class people, like you don't have the ability
Yeah.
to go out and buy like a whole suit of hockey pads or
Like
something like
soccer
that. It's
has
crazy.
been, and like obviously like this is removing like corrupt awful FIFA, but
Yeah,
like
jeez.
there's a beauty with soccer, and I think specifically with World Cup where you get to see countries that are particularly like usually maligned or disparaged like really showcase their passion and their skill and their
Yeah.
talent and their culture in a way that like you don't always get. And I think that that's something that like really speaks to like what you're saying of like it is a sport for everyone. And I really
And
so
I think even with the fans, there's an ownership
yeah.
over like there are players. They don't
Yeah.
represent like governments and like that. You speak to some fans around the world. Like I remember the one World Cup where Argentina were playing and I think they got knocked out in the quarterfinals and they were devastated. And like back home, we were in a recession. The government's corrupt. Like this was our
Yeah.
hope for happiness. Like
This was the thing.
we're behind it.
Yeah.
And most of the players come from working class backgrounds. They come from really tough areas where they've driven themselves with ambition and work ethic to get out of it, but they give back to those communities still. So
Yeah.
those players are closer with the fans than anything else, and that's why it's so important when the fans get behind them to feel that connectiveness.
Which I wonder if that drives a lot of the ways that the US team has developed in general, and almost like the aggression they have towards Mexico fans in the US, because I wonder like if there is a part of them that deeply wants that. Like they deeply want to be
Yes.
admired in the way that like these teams that they are playing are. And I think that also like the lack of that and the lack of like building fans, I think
Yeah.
probably also played in a lot of their the way the sport has become less egalitarian in the US and more of like how can you like get into it and know the right person and like that pipeline. And I think like the documentary does really well because I know that like we're kind of ragging on the US a lot from what they did, but I think that that showcases like I don't think that this documentary was scared to show the badness and like
Yeah.
the hurtful parts of the rivalry too, because rivalries are never easy. Like there is
Yeah.
always a kernel of pain there. And I think that they also did that really well for showcasing the US team and how like like everybody consistently put them down. Like, and
Yeah.
when they were fighting, they weren't playing a game just to take home a win. They were playing a game to justify getting funding to starting the MLS. They were playing a game to justify getting to a next step in like pushing soccer in the US.
I
And
mean,
so
I think at one point you hear Alexi Lalas is on a plane. She was asking him what where are you going? He's like, oh, I'm gonna go play soccer. And she's like, well, what do you do for a job? And he's like, I play soccer. And he's like, she was like, yeah, but how do you make money? He was like, I play soccer.
play
And it
soccer.
was just so baffling to this older American lady. She just couldn't fathom it.
Yeah. And I think that like that type of I think that there are two drives happening. I think what this documentary puts into perspective is understanding that the Mexico that the US met was a Mexico at the top. Like it was a Mexico that was performing really well. It was a Mexico
Yeah.
that had just hosted the World Cup. And then we kind of dip and the US rises because we were seeing a US that was a joke. And then the US starts to turn around. And so there's this
Heavy
first
investments.
so much investment. And like also like from a respect standpoint, Mexico didn't respect the US. And like you hear the players talk about how like the reason they got so angry wasn't because they were losing, like because they lost. They were getting angry because they did not respect the people who were beating them. And there's a change that happens in the
Yeah.
documentary where you can hear the kind of like passing of the torch, or like from like Rafa and like some of the other players. It's like, okay, well now we had to actually take them seriously. And then it becomes like it shifts. The US doesn't
Yeah.
respect Mexico because they're like, you have not respected us for so long. And so it's this constant like animosity that like the documentary didn't have to show the darker sides, but it shows how aggressive and violent it gets even between the players on the field.
Yeah.
And I mean, like the Mexican national team doesn't look like the greatest, right? Isn't in the greatest light in the South Korea portion for World Cup. And I think that like the ability to have the conversation from both sides is something that is hard to do, especially for something that is produced by Americans.
Yeah.
And they don't whitewash any of this. They very much put each of these players in a position where they kind of have to own up for what they did. Like Landon Donovan has to own up for being a dick. And Rafa Marquez has to own up for being very unsportsmanlike and injuring somebody. Like, and that balance is something like I've said like a lot, but like
Yeah.
it's hard to kind of really find words for understanding, striking that piece equally. And I think it does it for the most part.
It's interesting as well, just because like the two perspectives, like you said, like Mexico was such a powerhouse for such a for a while within the region as far as like and not taking them seriously. And then obviously like the heavy investment and US actually trying to develop and building out a team and even youth soccer as well, like
Yeah.
having under 17 teams being able to compete. Um but I think the difference is, and this is soccer in general, and it's why I love the sport and it's why I love things like the World Cup, is like players carry with them such a weight with certain countries and where
Yeah.
they're from and the communities that they're a part of. And you definitely feel that a lot more with the Mexican
Yeah.
portion of the documentary, that it means more. There's a weight to it
They're
as
not
opposed
fighting
to,
for a profession. They're fighting for a people. Like they see
yes,
themselves as representing the people of Mexico, not
yes,
like
absolutely.
themselves.
Yeah, yeah, and exactly. They carry the families with them. They carry the communities and the country with them,
Mhm.
and it's kind of like versus like even to the portion where the US is succeeding, it's just kind of like it becomes more almost this like elitism. Like, okay, we're better now. Like, we're
Yeah.
just going to continue believing we're awesome. We're USA. We're number one, as opposed to carrying the weight of their communities with them, or like whether they're MLS team or anything like that. It's more self-indulgent in a way, like
Yeah.
a vindication by individualism.
Yeah. And also like not recognizing that in order to get to a status, at least with Mexico, where they can hold their heads up like that, they had to literally put Mexicans into a climate they are not used to and rip them from their fans.
Yep.
Like that honestly like put me into a situation where I was like, when Mexico and US played in the qualifier last year, I was at a US bar, and oh, the US fans are so obnoxious. It was so bad.
Yeah.
So bad. Um but they were just like, they just kept rubbing it like in faces, like, oh well, we beat you all the time, and we always beat Mexico, and like it's been good, our team's been beating them. And I'm like, because you make them play in Ohio in
I
like
was to say
40 degrees.
I was gonna say, and it's funny though because then I do like that the documentary clearly highlights like every time they go to the Azteca, they're they're,
Yes.
they're terrified going in.
Elevation and heat, like they're, and I think that that's one of the cool things. Like you see the two perspectives on soccer and what
Yeah,
soccer means to them. But like, I'm gonna be honest, all I have learned from this documentary is that the US team are scared consistently. They're scared when they go into a match with Mexico, no matter what. And like they dread the Azteca. They dread that stadium.
that's an
Like,
to be fair, that is an intimidate. That is a soccer designed stadium, and I think that's some of the issues that the US is always going to face, and it's always going to be a persistent problem no matter what they do and how long or how big soccer gets in the country. It's the competing sport and the culture within the country, and just the fact that it's so large that you don't get that element of kind of like what
yeah,
I grew up in, where it's just like it was just soccer. You played it in the school ground. You played it after after you got home. You played it on the weekends. You watched it on TV. It was there. It's
yeah,
in, it's inbred into the culture, and most countries are that way. There's not really anything that competes with it, but versus the US,
yeah.
it's this what fifth or sixth, maybe biggest sport kind of behind like
Yeah.
the big four of what you think of. But then you look at the Plaza Azteca, like there was thought gone into that. That is a soccer designed stadium
It is
with packed
intimidating.
in those fans, and those fans know how to support the team. I think you
Mm-hmm.
and I were talking kind of previously. There's a culture there as far as singing songs, chanting, being involved. There's a history there. Oh, I went to the game with my granddad. Like
Yeah.
it's there that again it's in the genes, and the US just doesn't have that. Not to say that they won't down the line, but
Yeah.
they're trying to manufacture it and
Yeah.
catch up too quickly.
And I think what I'm hopeful of is like when you get towards the end of the documentary, and part of where they kind of do the racism was solved because we took a picture. But I think like beyond that, like weird, like we took picture with the Mexican team, we defeated being in a swing state and putting them in a
Yeah,
very racist city by taking a picture with them. What I actually think that shows is like there's a line that I forget his name, but one of the current US players, he's like, I we wanted to take a picture with them because we knew these guys, because we were
yeah.
playing with them
I
like
think it was
outside, they were playing.
Michael
Yes.
Bradley. Yeah,
Yeah, because they were
yeah,
playing with them in the MLS. They were
yeah,
playing with guys like Chicharito finally. They were getting to know them as people. And I
yeah,
think that that is something that has changed and I hope keeps changing, is like there is a rivalry, but there's also camaraderie that comes when you look at the World Cup and people who like both played on Arsenal but now playing on different country teams.
yeah.
Like, and I think that having that exposure, it also kind of removes some of the mystique. Like it's easier to not be afraid of Chicharito if you see him like getting frustrated in like the locker room after a loss or something, right?
Yeah.
And I think that like what that really highlights is it's almost like that immaturity. Like the anger and the aggression came from immaturity. And
They're
hopefully
young
they're
men.
changing. Yeah.
Yeah. Like it's tough. Like, and it feels silly to kind of make the comparison away, but like something that always stuck with me, kind of watching Ted Lasso and it, but the line of it just really kind of embodied something I've not really considered. He's just like, I'm just trying to make a difference on these young men. And they are like when
Yeah.
they're in the prime of their career, you're looking at from like 19 to like 28.
Yeah.
And
They're
most of them, if they
babies.
exactly, and if most of them have been groomed from a young age, coming through youth training systems, and all they know is soccer, they've not had to, some of them might not have had to deal with real world problems. If they're good enough, they've been plucked from the age of like I mean, even with Rafa Marquez, like he was picked
Yeah.
up at 15. Like he was starting to play semi and professional level at a young age. And soccer is all they know. And it's tough when your life hangs on the line like that, when your professional career hangs on, and you've got millions of viewers and things aren't going your way and you're young. It's going to happen again. It's a passionate sport. It's high intensity,
Yeah.
and it does bubble over. And I think that's the one thing. Like even with how Mexico were in the 2002 the South Korea World Cup, I've seen plenty of games like that, like
Oh yeah.
where the
Zidane.
players like just lose control. The game
Yeah.
goes against it. I've been involved in games like that, where as a teenager, and just nothing goes your way, and you
Yeah.
just get angry. But you're young, you
Yeah.
make mistakes, and it bubbles over. Like it's,
Yeah.
and that's always the thing that like, and again, I think that like you said, it kind of that important aspect, like kind of towards that the second episode is kind of where they start to see each other. And I love a good rivalry. I think a good rivalry. I mean, me and my brother were close in age siblings, and we competed on absolutely
Yeah.
everything. And it was fierce. It was intense. Like we said horrible, horrible things to each other, but it drove me to be better.
Yeah.
It drove me to have that aspect of I have to keep
Yeah.
going and dig deep and go. And I love seeing that. I respect a good
Yeah.
rivalry where two teams are just, they know they cannot lose. Not to an extent where it gets awfully, it
Yeah.
can happen, but it raises the
Yeah, it does.
quality of it.
Yeah. The match becomes something electric instead of something that's
Yeah.
just
You
happening.
feel the intensity.
Well, and I think that like the one thing that the documentary, the docuseries could have done better was maybe honing in a little bit more on where the US and Mexico sit in relation to the world stage. Like,
Yeah.
because I think what they do is they really focus on how they fit into CONCACAF or like the times that they were invited to Copa. And they kind of miss that Mexico is present, but our team is Memo Ochoa, and we know how to stop things. And that's where we've been for a while.
Yeah.
And the US didn't make 2018. And so I think I wish there had been a better way to really contextualize the fact that Mexico's never made it past the group of 16,
Yeah.
and the US sometimes haven't made it in at all, and or they get knocked out on the group stage. And I think that if you
Yeah.
had that contextualized piece, it would
Like the
add to,
larger aspect of
yeah,
it all.
it would almost add to the intimacy of what this rivalry means for two
They're
people that
fighting
like
for a spot amongst
exactly
the foundation of these world powers.
exactly. And I think that would have given it the edge, because then it's like these people are really intense against each other because they are both looked down on by everybody, and ultimately are trying to make themselves recognized on a larger stage than what they have, because like they dominate CONCACAF,
Yeah.
but like
Yeah.
when they get invited to Copa, like it's done.
It's not great.
So
I think one of the elements that I wish, and I maybe, because at this point you and I have both seen 2 episodes, and I think it's a 3 episode series, is that one thing that was interesting is for the most part, it's been American coaches, American investments on the US side, obviously. But when they hired Jurgen Klinsmann,
yeah.
he's a like world famous superstar. I mean, for Germany, like he was dominant. Like domestically, he was fantastic. Like
What's his
he
nationality again?
German.
German, yeah.
Oh yeah,
He
he's
speaks perfect
German.
Spanish.
But I mean, Jurgen Klinsmann even has like a celebration named after him. You have to be a top tier player to have a celebration named after you. Like it's the Klinsmann dive. Like he used to like dive and slide on his chest, and like everyone, that's how they call it. But one of the things that was interesting during his reign was he started bringing in American immigrants with nationalities. So there was German players, Norwegian players, but they were at US bases, but they were unique to that country as far as like they, were grew up. But when they came into the team, there was a real animosity of like, well, they're not really American. And it's kind of what you touched upon at the top. It's like all American. It's kind of like the country, I always got told when I first came in, oh, America's cool because it's a melting pot. And I'm like, but then you're not seeing that because you were still using these
Yeah.
outdated terms like all American. I'm like, but it continues to be again. My kids are half English. Like,
Yeah.
I want that to be an important part of who they know they are. They're not
Yeah.
just Americans. And even my wife, she's like, yeah, they're we have German ancestry. Like, I want that to be passed down, and
Yeah.
I hope that they kind of explore that they continue to have internal problems and trying to just find a US has a problem trying to find its voice.
Yeah.
Who are they, and what do they want to be about versus like Mexico again has just had that established
It
history.
Hearing you talk about that, it almost reminds me of like the importance of um the immigrants that were not to say immigrants, but like international players on the San Antonio Spurs for basketball. Like our best years were when we had a team made up of so many different nationalities.
Yeah.
And I think like because what comes with that is an understanding of how other people play. What comes with that is different connections to the sport. And when you
Different
can capture that, yeah,
perspectives.
different perspectives. And when you can capture that, like that can be gold.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that is fascinating. And I know, so I thought you were talking about the guy at the start of the documentary, the first
The
man.
Yugoslavian
Yeah, the Yugoslavian
player
guy.
who played
Yeah.
in the Mexican League,
And
and
speaks perfect
yes,
Spanish and is married to a Mexican
yes,
wife and like fell in love with corridos and
I
las
love that.
marinitas.
I love
That
that
man was
story.
adorable.
I was heartbroken when I was like, oh, this man's awesome, and they're like, yeah, and then he becomes the US coach. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
I had no
Well,
idea about that part of the history of the rivalry. I was like, Jesus, this
and
is
I
a
think the funny
loaded.
thing is too is like I think like they did better with him because he understood how another country played. He understood what went behind it, and I do think that like the US carries a large amount of inferiority like within them that makes it harder for them to overcome pieces. And I know we're pretty much at time, but like I can't wait to see what people think about this. And I'm looking at the rivalry with new eyes now. Obviously now even more hardcore Mexico. But it is interesting because I do want to see what part three is because it does look
Yeah,
like there's a concerted effort to address a lot of the racism that has like been at the foundation of it, especially after 2016. Um, but yeah, it's interesting, and I
it's I
wonder where it will go.
it's yeah, it's one of those things. I hope it kind of like I'd almost love it to leave on a note like continue to encourage the rivalry in a respectful way that like conflict and competition is great because again it like you
It
that
drives you to be
rivalry
better. Yeah.
exactly that done in a constructive way is important. It's going to be what drives both countries to
Mm-hmm.
want to continue to grow and be bigger, and
Yeah.
that's going to have an impact on the world stage as well. I mean,
Yeah.
hopefully we see that in the World Cup as as we lean into this. But finding a way, like you said, kind of like to be a bit more open with it. And again, I don't know about it on the Mexican
Yeah.
side, but like just embracing like the US needs to embrace their unique culture from all different landscapes and just
Yeah.
recognize that there are a huge swell of Mexican fans that live in the US, but they're Mexican Americans. They're part of the culture. They're part of the fabric of the country, and to shy them away
Yeah.
is not going to be how you win anyone over. It's not going to be how it drives you forward. So
Yeah. And
it's going to be
that's
interesting to see that third episode.
yeah. I hope as we get more involvement and it grows, like the talent that they're going to be picking up, and I think they've already started to pick up at MLS. That's Mexican American talent. Like
Yeah,
those are kids that have been in love with soccer. Those are
yeah,
kids who are tied to it. And this is where they can be the outlet. So
yeah.
Going forward, I want that. I'm gonna be way more invested in CONCACAF now. I
Yeah.
haven't usually cared
Yeah.
because it's a cakewalk, but
Do you think, based on what you've seen on the series, do you think it would be would you watch again, I guess, if they did a season two and focused on a different rivalry?
oh yeah, 100%. I feel like I've learned so much like about like you've talked about like the cultural relationships with soccer, the dynamics that go into programs across countries. Um the dirty laundry is always fun to learn. But yeah, no, I
Yeah.
would watch it if it was on a different rivalry. I don't really know them all because I'm very siloed into my is Mexico playing okay. Is there one in particular that you would love to see?
There's so many to tap into, and I guess it would be interesting just to see like if they continue to keep it on the international level or if they go domestic. I mean, there's such a catalog, such a history there for them to explore that they really could get multiple seasons out of this, and
Yeah.
really, again, like you said, they do a really good job of keeping this pretty balanced and getting these one-on-one interviews with multiple players and multiple people's involved from a political level, from a
Yeah.
journalistic level, from the players and the coaches level. Like it's done really well, and I hope we can see more of this, from different angles.
Yeah. Well, Aaron, why don't you tell everybody if you think they should watch the documentary series and where they can find you?
Uh, I absolutely think this is worth tuning in for and binging through the episodes. I think it's fantastic. I think you will learn a lot just because it is a bigger history than I think you'll realize, and there's a lot more that goes into it. And hopefully, everyone comes out with it with a bit more of a fresher perspective and maybe kind of like looking back and thinking, okay, maybe there's something I can do different now as a fan. If you're a US fan. But yeah, definitely, and I think there's so many great soccer football documentaries out there that to invest on if you're enjoying this World Cup kick to go out and watch as well. So, but if you want to hear more from me, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram and Hive at British CPA. You can also find me in the Discord, and I am loving every minute that we have the World Cup sub chat in our Discord at the moment.
Yeah, I think you should definitely watch this, especially if you are a US or a Mexico fan, or if you're just looking to learn more about honestly how soccer, football, how it's been in the US over time. I think this is also really good history on that. And you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Oh My Myth Randier. I'm also on Hive, but I am not using it really. I'm just there. And yeah, I was gonna say something, but I am Team Memo Ochoa, and
I love Ochoa.
that's
It's
where I
so hard
am.
not to root against Ochoa.
I am gonna hold on to that Lewandowski save for the next 4 years until Mexico resuscitates him again and puts him back in as a 42-year-old. Because they're going to, I can already
Stick
feel
stick him in stick him in a back to tank and let him heal, let him rest. He'll come back
it.
stronger than ever.
Awesome. Thank you all for listening and like and subscribe. I don't know where the buttons